Good morning. I am so excited to be here today and talk to you about hearing God's voice. It is my passion in life, and I hope you hear that. I wanted to start out today, though, with a quick story. We have a picture here of someone you may or may not recognize. For those of you that don't know, that's Josh, my 19-year-old. He doesn't look like that anymore, so I thought to give you a little better idea of perspective, since he's now bigger than John and the beard and everything. This is my dear sweet son getting eaten by a concrete hippo when he was 4 years old. So, now, this story begins when Josh was 4. Josh and I are standing at the kitchen sink one day, washing dishes, and he turns to me, and he says, "Mommy, you have a baby girl growing inside of you." Well, I wasn't expecting that to come out of my 4-year-old's mouth. Now, John and I were wanting to have more children, and we had let Josh know about that, so that wasn't a surprise. But at that point in time, we had no way of knowing if we were pregnant, and wouldn't even know for 2 weeks. We couldn't even test. So when my son tells me I have a baby growing inside of me, I'm going to do what every wise mother would do and say, "Josh, how do you know?" And he looks at me like any 4-year-old would and says, "God told me." Oh, okay. Now, continuing down that path of being the wise mother then, I look at Josh and ask the next logical question. "How do you know it was God?" And he looks at me and he says, "Mommy, anybody can hear God. All they have to do is listen." Enough said. No more questions from Mom. And 2 weeks later, we found out we were expecting. Now, it wasn't a little girl, it was Lucas. But Josh later told us he added that part because he already had a brother, and he didn't want another brother, he wanted a sister. So he did clarify. Now, why do I share that story? You're thinking, oh, that's a cute story. Your son told you were pregnant. What does that have to do with me? I want you to understand 2 very simple points here. Number 1, I believe that we are all capable of hearing God's voice, the shepherd's voice. You don't have to be anyone special. If a 4-year-old can hear his voice, I think we can too. The second point is we need to be able to recognize his voice when he speaks. It's really that easy. Now, I've heard it. I hear it all the time. Oh, I can't hear God's voice. God doesn't speak to me. Based on my experience, I have been teaching hearing God's voice since 2006 to hundreds of people from ages 11 to people in their 80s. And I would say to you, everyone can hear God's voice. But most of us haven't learned how to recognize that voice when he speaks. So what I want to focus on today is being able to recognize that voice. If I were to share one essential key with you today, this would be it. We know God's voice out of spending time with him every day. It's not any different than any other relationship that we would pursue. We know those relationships that we want to pursue, right? Those are the ones we invest in. Those are the ones we spend time in. It is no different than with God, and that should be the most important relationship that we pursue. Think about it. How do we know our mother's voice? How do we know our children's voice? How do we know our best friend's voice? Like when we pick up the phone without checking caller ID. It's out of our time spent with them. You know the situation, you've been in a crowded room and lots of people are talking, but yet you can still pick out your spouse's voice, your best friend's voice, because we spent time with them, because we know what it sounds like. Now, I need you to understand this. God created us for relationship with Him. That is the most important relationship. Please understand that. So we should desire to pursue that relationship and have the same intimacy, even more so than all of the other relationships that we pursue. We need to desire that intimacy. So what does that look like? I want to share with you 3 practices that I have found that have helped me understand and help recognize God's voice. Number 1, spend time reading about Him. It's a very simple way to learn to recognize God's voice. Now, if God were on Facebook and we wanted to get to know Him, what would we do? We'd get to be a creeper, wouldn't we? Yeah, we'd start checking Him out. What are His likes? Who are His friends? What pictures has He posted? We start, reading everything we can about Him. Well, you know what? God has a Facebook page. It's this right here. It's called the Bible. And He wants you to be a creeper. He wants you to stalk Him. He wants you to check it out and find out who He is. As we spend time in the Bible, as we spend time reading about Him, this is how we get to know Him. We start to find out, what does His voice sound like? How does He talk to us? How does He talk to others? How does He interact with us? What is He like? And we're told right here, He is love. He is faithful. He's a God of peace. So let's look at a couple of posts from His page, as it were. We see 1 John 4:8. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. That's right here. We just found something out about God. He is love. How about another post? Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, and He is the faithful God, keeping His covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love Him and keep His commandments. So we see God is love, and we see God is faithful. Now what else? 1 Thessalonians 5:23. May God Himself, the God of peace, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. So we see, checking out the Facebook page, we start to read about Him, we find out He's love, we find out He's faithful, we find out He's the God of peace. So we start hearing voices that go, you can't do that. Who are you? You're worthless. We know that's not God. That doesn't sound like Him. It doesn't line up with this. But you have to know what this says first. It's kind of like when somebody's Facebook page gets hijacked, and then there's kind of funny post on there that doesn't really sound like them. That's how it is when we hear that stranger's voice. It doesn't line up with who God says He is. And we don't follow that voice. We go, that's not the right voice. That's not my God. So that's number 1. So number 2, we spend time with those who know Him and know how to hear His voice. It's just like anything else. If we want to learn how to do something, we hang out with those who know. So if I wanted to learn photography, I now know to go to Steve, right? Or I talk to Tara Young, or Kayla McConkey, or Mike, or Dick, because they're all involved in photography. So I hang out with them. How do you do this? I start reading the books that they read. I go to their meetings. Oh, you guys have a meeting I can come to and we can have discussion? Yeah, those of us that want to know God, we do that too. It's called church. Where we get to hear about Him and hear what He's like. And there's small groups where you can sit and discuss it. And so it helps to be around others who know God better, who have heard His voice, who know what it sounds like. So we can ask them questions. Am I really hearing? I thought I heard this. Does that make sense? Is that who you know God to be? And they go, yeah, I don't know, or well, let's work on that a little bit. Okay, so that's number 2. Now how else can we do it? This is my favorite thing to do. Spend time with God alone. You listen to the worship music today, I could just sit and listen to that all day long, and it draws me closer to God. I just rest in His presence. Because there's a difference between knowing about someone and knowing them. Now, John and I have known each other for a long time, my husband here. I didn't get to know him intimately by reading about him. No, that just doesn't happen that way. When we met, we decided we wanted to get to know each other. We spent time with each other. We spent time with other friends. But to get to that place of intimacy, we spent time one-on-one. That's where intimacy comes. That's what intimacy grows out of. So if you want to be able to recognize that voice, there's nobody in this world that is going to sound like John to me. I know his voice. I know what he says. I know what he's like. You want that intimacy with God? You have to spend that one-on-one time with him. Know what he's like. Know what the voice sounds like. So as you pursue that deeper relationship with someone, how do you do that? Sometimes you just kind of sit and think about them, think how cool it would be with them. With God, that's called meditation. Or maybe you just want to sit with them, hold their hand, just be with them. You don't have to say anything at all. It just feels good just to be there with them. With God, that's called time in silence, solitude. Or, do you ever have that favorite song that when it comes on, that it makes you think about that special person? With God, that's called worship. Do those sound like something called the disciplines? Yeah. But this is how we come to know God. This is how we grow to recognize His voice. These are all practices that when we spend time in them, each and every day we grow to know God, to recognize His voice. So in summary, we come to know His voice by spending time reading about Him. We come to know His voice by spending time with those who know Him and know how to hear His voice. And we come to recognize God's voice by spending time with Him alone. And the more time we invest in these practices, the more we discover who God is, what His voice sounds like, how He comes to us, what He says. And we begin to know Him. And then it's at this point that we're able to recognize His voice and be guided and directed by Him, by the one who loves us. So when the shepherd says, "Come follow me," we listen.